The War of Art, by Steven Pressfield is a book that aims to help people overcome their creative blocks and achieve their creative goals. The book is divided into 3 parts: resistance, combating resistance, and beyond resistance. Here are some of the important points from each section. Part 1. Resistance. Resistance is the force that opposes us whenever we try to create or pursue something that is important to us. Resistance comes in many forms, including fear, self-doubt, procrastination, addiction, and distraction. Resistance is a natural and necessary part of the creative process, but it can also be overcome. Part 2. Combating resistance. The only way to overcome resistance is through work. We must sit down and do the work, even when we don't feel like it. We must develop a regular routine and stick to it, even when we don't feel motivated or inspired. We must embrace our failures and learn from them. Failure is a necessary part of the creative process. Part 3. Beyond resistance. The most important thing we can do to overcome resistance is to turn pro. This means treating our creative work as a profession and committing to it fully. We must adopt a professional mindset, which means taking responsibility for our work, showing up every day, and focusing on the long-term goal. We must also cultivate a sense of humility and surrender, recognizing that our creative work is not about us, but about something larger than ourselves. Pressfield believes that resistance is not only present in creative pursuits, but also in any endeavor that requires growth, such as starting a business, changing careers, or embarking on a spiritual journey. Resistance is fueled by our own fears and self-doubt, and it often takes the form of rationalizations, justifications, and excuses. Pressfield argues that we can't wait for inspiration or motivation to strike before we start our creative work. Instead, we must cultivate a daily practice of showing up and doing the work, even when we don't feel like it. One of the key ways to combat resistance is to establish a routine or ritual that signals to our subconscious mind that it's time to get to work. This could be something as simple as setting aside a specific time and place to work each day, or wearing a certain piece of clothing that helps us get in the zone. Pressfield emphasizes the importance of facing our fears and taking action despite them. He encourages readers to act in the face of fear, and to trust that the universe will support us when we take bold steps towards our goals. Finally, Pressfield argues that the true reward of creative work is not external recognition or success, but the internal sense of fulfillment that comes from doing what we were meant to do. He encourages readers to focus on the process of creation, rather than the outcome, and to find joy in the act of bringing something new into the world. Pressfield believes that resistance is an inner force that we can learn to recognize and overcome. He encourages readers to pay attention to the ways that resistance shows up in their lives and to develop strategies for dealing with it. One of the key strategies for overcoming resistance is to cultivate a sense of discipline and self-mastery. Pressfield argues that we must learn to control our impulses and emotions, and to stay focused on our goals even when we encounter setbacks or obstacles. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of taking breaks and resting, as well as the importance of cultivating a sense of play and experimentation in our creative work. He argues that these activities can help us recharge our creative batteries and tap into new sources of inspiration. Another key theme of The War of Art is the importance of trusting the creative process and surrendering to the unknown. Pressfield encourages readers to embrace uncertainty and to trust that the creative work will lead us where we need to go, even if we don't know where that is. Finally, Pressfield argues that the act of creation is a deeply spiritual endeavor that connects us to something greater than ourselves. He encourages readers to view their creative work as a form of service to others, and to recognize the ways that their work can have a positive impact on the world. Pressfield believes that resistance is an intelligent force that is always trying to stop us from doing the work that we're meant to do. He argues that resistance is like a negative force field that surrounds us and that we must learn to penetrate in order to do our best work. One of the key strategies for overcoming resistance is to develop a deep sense of self-awareness. Pressfield encourages readers to examine their thoughts and behaviors, to identify their patterns of resistance, and to develop strategies for overcoming them. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of cultivating a sense of purpose and meaning in our creative work. He argues that our work must be grounded in a sense of mission or calling, and that we must be willing to do whatever it takes to fulfill that mission. Another important theme of The War of Art is the idea of turning pro. Pressfield argues that in order to overcome resistance and do our best work, we must adopt a professional mindset and commit to our work fully. This means showing up every day, doing the work, and treating our creative endeavors as a serious profession. Finally, Pressfield encourages readers to cultivate a sense of gratitude and humility in their creative work. He argues that creative work is a gift, and that we must approach it with a sense of reverence and gratitude. He also encourages readers to acknowledge the contributions of others and to recognize the ways that our work is connected to a larger community or tradition. Pressfield believes that resistance can manifest in a variety of ways, including procrastination, self-doubt, perfectionism, and addiction. He encourages readers to be aware of these different forms of resistance and to develop strategies for overcoming them. One of the key strategies for overcoming resistance is to create a daily practice or routine around our creative work. Pressfield argues that establishing a consistent habit of showing up and doing the work, even if it's just for a few minutes each day, can help us build momentum and overcome resistance over time. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of surrounding ourselves with supportive people who understand and value our creative work. He argues that having a community of like-minded individuals can help us stay motivated, share resources, and hold each other accountable. Another important theme of The War of Art is the idea that creative work requires a willingness to take risks and embrace failure. Pressfield encourages readers to be bold and courageous in their creative endeavors, and to recognize that failure is a natural part of the creative process. Finally, Pressfield argues that creative work requires a certain level of detachment and non-attachment. He encourages readers to approach their work with a sense of detachment from the outcome, and to recognize that the creative process is its own reward, regardless of the external results. At the same time, he also acknowledges that creative work can be deeply personal and emotional, and that it can be difficult to separate ourselves from our creations. Pressfield argues that resistance is strongest when we are on the verge of a breakthrough or a major change in our lives. He encourages readers to recognize these moments and to use them as opportunities to break through resistance and move forward in their creative work. Another key strategy for overcoming resistance is to develop a deep sense of trust in ourselves and our creative abilities. Pressfield argues that self-doubt and fear are major forms of resistance, and that we must learn to trust ourselves and our instincts in order to do our best work. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of cultivating a sense of resilience and persistence in our creative work. He argues that creative work is inherently difficult and that we must be willing to persevere through setbacks and failures in order to achieve our goals. Another important theme of The War of Art is the idea of shipping, or putting our work out into the world even if it's not perfect. Pressfield encourages readers to embrace the concept of done is better than perfect, and to recognize that the act of putting our work out into the world is a powerful form of resistance breaking. Finally, Pressfield argues that creative work is a lifelong journey of growth and discovery. He encourages readers to embrace this journey and to view their creative work as a never-ending process of learning and exploration. Pressfield argues that creative work requires a certain level of discipline and focus. He encourages readers to eliminate distractions and to create an environment that is conducive to creative work. Another important strategy for overcoming resistance is to develop a sense of playfulness and curiosity in our creative work. Pressfield encourages readers to approach their work with a sense of experimentation and play, and to embrace the process of trial and error. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of taking care of ourselves physically, mentally, and emotionally. He argues that creative work can be exhausting and that we must prioritize our health and well-being in order to do our best work. Another key theme of The War of Art is the idea that creative work requires a certain level of faith or trust in something beyond ourselves. Pressfield encourages readers to tap into this sense of faith or spirituality, whatever that may look like for them, in order to stay motivated and inspired in their work. Finally, Pressfield argues that creative work is ultimately a form of service to others. He encourages readers to view their work as a way to make a positive impact on the world, and to recognize the ways that their creative contributions can inspire and uplift others. Pressfield argues that resistance often arises when we are faced with our true calling or purpose in life. He encourages readers to embrace their calling and to recognize that creative work is often a reflection of our deepest values and passions. Another important strategy for overcoming resistance is to develop a sense of detachment from the opinions of others. Pressfield argues that creative work requires us to take risks and to be vulnerable, and that we cannot let the fear of criticism or rejection hold us back from doing our best work. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of being open to inspiration and to the unexpected. He encourages readers to remain curious and to approach their work with a sense of wonder, and to recognize that creative breakthroughs often come when we least expect them. Another key theme of The War of Art is the idea that creative work requires a certain level of courage and bravery. Pressfield argues that we must be willing to face our fears and to take risks in order to achieve our creative goals. Finally, Pressfield encourages readers to view resistance not as something to be feared or avoided, but as a natural part of the creative process. He argues that resistance is simply a sign that we are on the right track and that we are pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zones. By embracing resistance and learning to overcome it, we can become more resilient and creative in our work. Pressfield argues that creative work often requires us to confront our own fears, insecurities, and limiting beliefs. He encourages readers to recognize these internal obstacles and to work through them in order to achieve their creative goals. Another important strategy for overcoming resistance is to develop a sense of routine and structure in our creative work. Pressfield argues that having a regular schedule and sticking to it can help us to develop good habits and to overcome the temptation to procrastinate or avoid our work. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of having a clear vision or purpose for our creative work. He encourages readers to define their goals and to stay focused on their larger vision, even in the face of setbacks or challenges. Another key theme of The War of Art is the idea that creative work is a collaborative process. Pressfield argues that we must be open to feedback and criticism from others, and that we must be willing to seek out and collaborate with other creative individuals in order to grow and develop in our work. Finally, Pressfield encourages readers to embrace the process of creative work, even when it is difficult or challenging. He argues that the act of creating is itself a form of resistance breaking, and that we must be willing to embrace the journey and the process, even when the end result is uncertain. Pressfield emphasizes the importance of taking action and starting our creative projects, even if we don't feel ready or if we are unsure of our abilities. He argues that the act of starting is often the hardest part, and that we must be willing to take the first step in order to make progress in our creative work. Another key strategy for overcoming resistance is to develop a sense of resilience and perseverance. Pressfield argues that creative work is often filled with setbacks and challenges, and that we must be willing to pick ourselves up and keep going, even in the face of failure or disappointment. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of developing a sense of authenticity and vulnerability in our creative work. He argues that we must be willing to be honest and open in our work, and to share our true selves with our audience. Another important theme of The War of Art is the idea that creative work requires a certain level of humility and surrender. Pressfield encourages readers to let go of their ego and to recognize that their work is not solely their own, but rather a product of a larger creative force or energy. Finally, Pressfield encourages readers to recognize that resistance can take many different forms, and that we must be vigilant in identifying and overcoming it in all its various manifestations. He argues that resistance can take the form of procrastination, self-doubt, perfectionism, and many other forms, and that we must be willing to recognize and address these forms of resistance in order to achieve our creative goals. Pressfield argues that creative work often involves a certain level of risk-taking and uncertainty, and that we must be willing to embrace this uncertainty in order to achieve our goals. He encourages readers to take risks and to be willing to fail in order to learn and grow in their creative work. Another key theme of The War of Art is the importance of developing a sense of discipline and self-mastery in our creative work. Pressfield argues that we must be willing to make sacrifices and to prioritize our creative work over other distractions in order to achieve our goals. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of maintaining a sense of humor and perspective in our creative work. He encourages readers to not take themselves too seriously and to recognize that creative work should ultimately be enjoyable and fulfilling. Another important strategy for overcoming resistance is to surround ourselves with a supportive community of fellow creatives. Pressfield argues that having a community of like-minded individuals can help us to stay motivated and inspired in our creative work. Finally, Pressfield encourages readers to recognize that creative work is ultimately a form of service to others. He argues that creative work is a way to share our gifts and talents with the world and to contribute to something larger than ourselves. Pressfield argues that resistance is a universal force that affects everyone, regardless of their background or creative discipline. He encourages readers to recognize that resistance is not a personal failing, but rather a natural part of the creative process. Another important theme of The War of Art is the idea that creative work often involves a certain level of sacrifice and suffering. Pressfield argues that we must be willing to embrace this suffering and to use it as a source of motivation and inspiration in our creative work. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of developing a sense of purpose and meaning in our creative work. He argues that creative work is not just about creating something beautiful or entertaining, but rather about contributing to the larger human experience and making a positive impact on the world. Another key strategy for overcoming resistance is to develop a sense of detachment and non-attachment in our creative work. Pressfield encourages readers to focus on the process of creating, rather than becoming attached to the end result or outcome of their work. Finally, Pressfield encourages readers to recognize that creative work is ultimately a form of self-expression and self-discovery. He argues that creative work can help us to better understand ourselves and our place in the world, and that we must be willing to embrace this journey of self-discovery in order to achieve our creative goals. Pressfield argues that resistance often takes the form of self-sabotage and self-doubt, and that we must be willing to recognize and address these negative patterns in order to achieve our creative goals. He encourages readers to cultivate a sense of self-awareness and to pay attention to their thoughts and emotions in order to identify and overcome these forms of resistance. Another important theme of The War of Art is the idea that creative work is a spiritual practice, and that it can help us to connect with a larger sense of purpose and meaning in our lives. Pressfield argues that creative work can help us to access a deeper level of consciousness and to tap into a larger creative force or energy. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of taking a professional approach to our creative work. He argues that we must be willing to treat our creative work as a job, and to put in the time and effort necessary to achieve our goals. Another important strategy for overcoming resistance is to develop a sense of gratitude and appreciation for our creative work. Pressfield encourages readers to recognize the privilege and opportunity that comes with being able to pursue creative work, and to cultivate a sense of gratitude for this gift. Finally, Pressfield encourages readers to recognize that creative work is ultimately a journey, rather than a destination. He argues that creative work is a never-ending process of growth and discovery, and that we must be willing to embrace this journey and to continue learning and growing in our creative work. Pressfield emphasizes the importance of taking action in our creative work, rather than just planning or dreaming about it. He argues that we must be willing to take risks and to put ourselves out there in order to achieve our creative goals. Another key theme of The War of Art is the importance of overcoming fear in our creative work. Pressfield argues that fear is one of the primary forms of resistance, and that we must be willing to face our fears and push through them in order to achieve our creative goals. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of developing a sense of resilience and persistence in our creative work. He argues that creative work often involves setbacks and failures, and that we must be willing to persevere in the face of these challenges in order to achieve our goals. Another important strategy for overcoming resistance is to develop a sense of curiosity and openness in our creative work. Pressfield encourages readers to approach their creative work with a sense of wonder and exploration, and to be open to new ideas and experiences. Finally, Pressfield encourages readers to recognize the importance of rest and recovery in their creative work. He argues that creative work can be mentally and emotionally taxing, and that we must be willing to take breaks and recharge in order to maintain our creative energy and momentum. Pressfield argues that creative work often involves a certain level of discomfort or even pain, and that we must be willing to embrace this discomfort in order to achieve our creative goals. He encourages readers to recognize that discomfort is a natural part of the creative process, and to use it as a source of motivation and inspiration. Another important theme of The War of Art is the idea that creative work often involves a certain level of solitude and isolation. Pressfield argues that we must be willing to embrace this solitude and to use it as a source of focus and concentration in our creative work. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of community and support in our creative work. He argues that we must be willing to seek out and cultivate relationships with other creative individuals, and to use these relationships as a source of feedback, accountability, and inspiration. Another key strategy for overcoming resistance is to develop a daily practice or routine for our creative work. Pressfield encourages readers to establish a consistent habit of creative work, and to treat this habit as a non-negotiable part of their daily routine. Finally, Pressfield encourages readers to recognize that creative work is ultimately a form of service to others. He argues that creative work has the power to inspire and uplift others, and that we must be willing to share our work with the world in order to make a positive impact. Pressfield argues that creative work requires a certain level of humility and surrender. He encourages readers to recognize that their creative work is ultimately a collaboration with a larger creative force or energy, and that they must be willing to surrender control and allow this force to guide their work. Another important theme of The War of Art is the idea that creative work requires a certain level of sacrifice. Pressfield argues that we must be willing to make sacrifices in other areas of our lives in order to prioritize our creative work, and that we must be willing to let go of certain comforts or distractions that may be hindering our creative progress. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of treating our creative work as a craft, rather than just a means to an end. He argues that we must be willing to put in the time and effort necessary to master our craft, and that we must be willing to approach our creative work with a sense of discipline and rigor. Another important strategy for overcoming resistance is to develop a sense of detachment from our work. Pressfield encourages readers to recognize that their creative work is ultimately separate from their identity or self-worth, and that they must be willing to let go of their attachment to the outcome in order to achieve their creative goals. Finally, Pressfield encourages readers to recognize that creative work is ultimately a form of self-expression and self-discovery. He argues that creative work can help us to access a deeper sense of meaning and purpose in our lives, and that we must be willing to embrace this journey of self-discovery and growth in our creative work. Pressfield argues that resistance can take many forms, including procrastination, self-doubt, and distraction. He encourages readers to be vigilant and to recognize these forms of resistance in their own lives, so that they can take steps to overcome them. Another important theme of The War of Art is the idea that creative work requires a certain level of faith and trust. Pressfield argues that we must be willing to trust in ourselves and in our creative vision, even in the face of uncertainty or doubt. Pressfield also emphasizes the importance of developing a sense of purpose and mission in our creative work. He argues that we must be clear about why we are pursuing our creative goals, and that we must be willing to use our work as a means of serving a larger purpose or mission in the world. Another key strategy for overcoming resistance is to develop a sense of playfulness and experimentation in our creative work. Pressfield encourages readers to approach their work with a sense of curiosity and play, and to be open to trying new things and taking risks. Finally, Pressfield encourages readers to recognize that creative work is ultimately a journey, rather than a destination. He argues that we must be willing to embrace the process of creating, and to recognize that our creative journey will involve both successes and failures, joys and sorrows.